It's with great pleasure that I am able to introduce Professor Guy Standing from the University of Bath in the UK on behalf of Sydney Ideas and the Department of Government and International Relations here at the University of Sydney. Guy is Professor of Economic Security at the University of Bath and also former Director of the Socio-Economic Security Programme at the International Labour Organization. He is a founder member and co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network, a non-government organisation that promotes citizenship income for all. Professor Standing has published numerous books and articles examining themes related to the global transformation of work and labour. And today his talk is on the Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. The themes addressed in Guy's book have always been timely, but perhaps no more so than now, when questions are being raised about job security, the impact of economic globalisation, the role of social movements, and how and why to achieve change in the current status quo. So please join with me in welcoming Professor Standing to this event.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for coming in an evening talk. I was on the Margaret Throsby show today, and I had to choose 5 pieces of music, and it happens to be my birthday, so I chose one piece non-classical music, but I won't leave you to know which particular piece of music that was, because it would give away my age. I have been writing on this subject, as Paul said, for some years, and the book that preceded the Precariat is called Work After Globalization. It took the better part of 30 years to write because I was trying to escape from laborism and all the values of 20th century labor. I've long argued that work is much more than labor, and that every age has its silliness when it comes to saying what is work and what is not work. There's a good argument for saying that our age is the silliest of all. We treat many forms of work with complete disrespect. And it's summarized best by a statement by Arthur Pigou, an economist of Cambridge, who said in 1922, he said, if I hire a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up. If I marry her and she continues to do precisely the same work, national income and employment go down. And we have continued with the sexist practice ever since. And it is about time the politicians and our labor statisticians changed to respect the many forms of work, particularly the work that women do and men increasingly do, let us hope, that are disregarded in our statistics. Now, the book, The Precariat, stemmed from the fact that when I was going around the world presenting Work After Globalization, there was one theme that students and activists, wherever I went, stopped writing, stopped talking, and started listening. And you could always hear a pin drop. And that is the Precariat. So I decided to try and write a narrative that would reach out to non-specialists. I'm a labor economist, but I wanted to find a narrative that could be read by lay people as well as specialist academics. So that's the origin of the book, but like all books, it has a life of its own. And when I'm presenting it, I'm reminded of the aphorism of Heraclitus, who said, "You never step into the same river twice." So I'm not quite sure which version of the book will come out this evening or any other presentation of it that I make. What the book tries to do is ask and answer 5 questions. What is the Precariat? Why care about it? Why is it growing? Who is entering the Precariat? And where is it taking us as society? Now, there are 2 ways of looking at that first question, what is it? One can think of Weberian ideal types. So you're in it or you're not in it. and different categories. Or you can think of a process of precariatization. And I've tried to convey both senses in both of these books, but I'm going to concentrate this evening very much on the former. And the way of looking at it is to think that globalization over the last 30 years has resulted in a class fragmentation and a globalized class structure superimposed on other forms of old class structures. And this globalized class structure consists of an elite of abysmally affluent, powerful individuals with their billions and their global citizenship. These people are always on the edge of criminality. We know their names. We wish we didn't. And we wish they'd go away, but they don't. A long way below them in terms of income is a salariat, those people who still got long-term employment security with all the benefits that go with that. Alongside the salariat in terms of income is a growing group of what I call professions, combining the words professional and technician. The professions do not want employment security. That's for wimps. They're project-oriented, they've got their computers over their shoulders, they've got all their high gadgetry and their contacts, and they're doing very nicely, thank you very much. Their only problem is the risk of burnout at age 32 and a half, but we know that sort of lifestyle. Below them is the old, disappearing working class that Andre Gors said was dead many years ago and has been clinging on and shrinking everywhere. The irony is that our labor policies, our social protection policies, our labor law, and so on, were all built for that class during the 20th century, and yet is a dwindling minority. It's below the old core working class that the precariat has been emerging, and I'll come to the definition in a moment. And below the precariat is what I would call a lumpen precariat, or an underclass. And that's the first point I want to make, which is that the precariat is not an underclass. It is wanted by international capital and by governments. Now, the precariat is a class in the making. Any of you who are in Marxist traditions will know that there's a difference between a class in the making and a class for itself, one which knows what it wants. At the moment, the precariat is very much a class in the making. The term urban nomads is sometimes used. A few other terms have been trying to become a popular way of conveying what is happening. We start by thinking that people in the precariat suffer from multiple forms of insecurity. They have none of the 7 forms of labor security that I document in the books that the working class had built up in the 20th century. They've lost those. A second defining feature is they have a very unique pattern of social income. By that I mean the various components that people receive, not necessarily wage income. The precariat rely almost overwhelmingly on money wages if they can get them. They have no access to enterprise benefits, or very few of them, fragile access to state benefits, little opportunity for private benefits, and a very shrinking community base to support them in need. They are, in a sense, denizens, not citizens. A denizen is an old concept from Roman times and 13th century England to refer to somebody who is given a more limited range of rights than the citizen. And more people are denizens in being denied one or more of the various forms of rights. But not only are they insecure in the labor market and insecure in their housing and in other respects, But the critical defining feature, I think, is that they lack an occupational identity and an occupational narrative that they can give their lives. People do not feel they are becoming something. They do not feel that they are making something worthwhile of their life through their work. They're having to take bits and pieces activities and shift activities, and I'll come back to the implications of that. Very much key to that is the absence of what Hannah Arendt, in her wonderful book, The Human Condition of 1958, called a social memory. They do not feel that they belong to a community which is handing down the ethics, the values, the standards from generation to generation. They have an absence of an anchor to give their life a sense of stability. And at the same time, there's a failure of any shadow of the future. I meet you today, you meet me today, we're never going to meet again. So you feel you can take opportunistic advantage of me, and I can try and do the same to you. It's eroding the sense of reciprocity and social solidarity in the relations we have with one another. So those are the defining features, and one can see a process analogous to what happened in the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century. Labour historians and other historians have always discussed the process of proletarianization, which is a process of habituating people as workers to stable, long-term, full labour. That was proletarianization. At the moment, we're seeing a very different process of precariatization, habituating a growing minority of people to a life of unstable labour, so that they get used to feeling insecure. Now, before ending on the first question, I want to emphasize one very important point, which is that there are at the moment varieties of precariat. Some people are falling out of old working class communities and jobs that their parents or friends used to do, and are entering, with relatively little education, this insecure life. This group tends to be looking at the past atavistically and would love long-term jobs that are not coming back. There's a second variety, made up often of migrants and minorities, who regard their labour instrumentally. They keep their heads down. It's better than they had in the past, wherever they came from, so they don't make much fuss. But there's a third variety, and this is the variety that I find myself addressing around the world, which is a progressive, angry group of people who are looking for something much better. This group does not look back nostalgically for a period of a golden age of labour. They do not want that. That is for their past generation. They want something more exciting. They want to do work. They want to be creative, but they don't want the drabness that goes with long-term, stable, full-time labour. The second question, why care? Well, first of all, we're all vulnerable to being in the precariat, or to having our children being in the precariat, or our friends and neighbours. We see in their faces the possibility that we may also experience it. But there are 4 A's that help define why we should care. The first A is anxiety. People in the precariat who fear falling into the precariat suffer from chronic anxiety, and in particular, from a growing sense of uncertainty. Uncertainty that comes with distant decisions being made that affect our lives, the risk of ecological or other forms of shock over which we have no control, and an inability to calculate the probability of a risk. An economist can tell you that if you can't calculate the probabilities of a risk, you can't insure. And this uncertainty means that people suffer from considerable anxiety. The second A is anomie, Durkheimian anomie. The anomie that arises from a despair of escape. More and more people who find themselves in the precariat have no prospect of social mobility, whatever the politicians may tell us. They feel they're trapped. And it goes together with what I call the precariatized mind. If there's anybody in this room who has a prescription for avoiding the development of the precariatized mind, I urge you to patent it with WIPO, because you'll become very affluent very quickly, because most of us suffer from this particular predicament. The precariatized mind, roughly speaking, is when we feel we have no control over our time. We're having to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, network here, network there, arbitrage between activities, because we don't know which one will lead to advantage and which will not. So more and more people in the precariat are having to do a whole range of things, flitting between activities, and in the process suffering from newfound illnesses such as attention deficit syndrome, which goes with a lot of other names. The third form of A is alienation. Alienation is very specific to the precariat. Alienation arises from the fact that increasingly people cannot do what they wish to do and cannot do what they think they are capable of doing, often with education that was supposed to give them that capacity to do it. And at the same time, they have to do a lot of things that they do not wish to do. So it's a double whammy. And that sense of double whammy means that people feel underemployed at the same time as they feel overemployed because there are too many demands on their time. I try and document in the book the consequences of that, which includes an erosion of empathy, an erosion of the capacity to identify with other people and put ourselves in their position. And the fourth A, you've probably guessed, is anger. The first three A's are creating a palpable anger across the world by the millions who are going into the precariat. We saw that anger last year in various ways, and it was interesting that in the book I'd used the term, there would be days of rage. And a book in England came out just before the August riots, and various journalists called me up and said, "Were you actually predicting the events?" And I said, "No, not really. It's merely that one can predict from what are these developments that this sort of outbreak is going to become increasingly common." Third question, why is it growing? Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this, you'll be glad to know, because otherwise we'd be here all evening. But the major things that have taken place, I just want to list, and you can look at the books if you're interested. First of all, there's no smoking gun. It's not one factor. But globalization led to economic liberalization of markets around the world. We all know that. What happened was that governments everywhere in the rich countries liberalized their labor markets, and in doing so, trebled the world's labor supply, almost overnight. And that trebling of world labor supply ushered in millions and millions of workers resigned to be working for 1/50th or 1/40th of the wages in this country, in Europe, in North America. Now, any economist could tell you that this would lead to a process of convergence, that wages and benefits would start to fall in the rich countries long before they had chance to come up very far in the developing countries. Now, if they didn't fall, good jobs would flood to India, and we would have a real problem. So governments, in effect, made a Faustian bargain with their peoples. And the Faustian bargain went something like this. We know it's not possible politically to allow wages and benefits to plunge. And therefore, we're going to cushion the gradual decline of wages through labor subsidies, through tax credits, through cheap credit, and allow a consumption binge. They didn't have to make that Faustian bargain, but they did. And of course, every Faustian bargain has a limit. And it came in 2008. Because all those giveaways and subsidies helped build up the deficits and run down people's savings, and we had the financial crash. Now, when I say they didn't have to make that Faustian bargain, they could have said to financial capital in particular in the 1980s, we are changing the rules, and a result of changing the rules, you, tiny elite, will get vastly higher incomes because of the ratio of capital to labor and so on, and the bargaining position of workers. Your brilliance is not increasing. Your merit-worthiness is not increasing. But we're altering the rules, and in return, some of the returns that will go to the elite should be shared. That's what they should have done, but now we're paying the price. They went for a Faustian bargain. But the big story, as far as labor and work is concerned, is that governments opted for what is euphemistically called labor market flexibility. Now, when I first started to write about this, when I was much younger in the 1980s, I remember the Director General of the ILO called me in and he said, "Guy, you're wasting your time working on this subject because in a couple of years it will be passé." I said, well, I don't think so. And here we are, 28 years later, it's still the #1 subject among labor economists around the world. And very briefly, there are 3 forms of labor market flexibility that governments have pursued. The first is called numerical flexibility, lovely words that are used to convey simple processes. Essentially, this means rolling back employment security. So what we've seen is increasing casualization. Australia, some of the unions boast that Australia leads the world. I've got some disappointing news for them. You're not nearly at the front, but you're doing quite well in keeping up with the average. There's been a lot of casualization and all of that you know about. The second form of flexibility is wage system flexibility. There has been a decentralization of bargaining, a growing width of wage differentials, a growth of income distribution that we've talked about already. But there's 1 or 2 factors that I would like to mention that because they get chronically insufficient attention. The first is that the social income inequality has grown much more than income inequality as measured by conventional statistics and by Gini coefficients and so on. And this arises from the fact that the salariat have been gaining enterprise benefits, paid holidays, paid pensions, paid this, paid that, all sorts of subsidized benefits that get taxed much lower rate than incomes. Whereas the precariat and those around them have been losing those benefits that they used to have. And if you look at the combination of trends, of money, wages, and the benefits, the growth of inequality is much greater. In a sense, we have seen a commodification of labor because this precariat has been relying on money wages, as I mentioned earlier, for their income without those benefits. The third form of flexibility is called functional flexibility. Now, I don't know how many labor economists are here this evening, But one of the things that annoys me most when I hear some labour economists talking and commentators often writing is to equate job insecurity with employment insecurity. Employment insecurity has grown because of those flexibility policies that I mentioned earlier, whereas job insecurity refers to the fact that people have less control over what it is they do inside their employment, and that the control has passed to administrators and to outside agents away from the person doing the work. And to give you an example, just to show the difference between the two concepts, France Telecom is one of the biggest employers in Europe, 86,000 long-term employees. And they have very good employment security. And suddenly they found that they were having a spate of suicides. And they said, why are we getting suicides? They're paid very well, they have long-term employment security. And they called in some outside investigators, and they said, well, the reason is that you've taken away their job security by forcing them to move departments and change job descriptions at every 3 or 4 months. And that differentiation, I think, is important because both of these have been taking place. And this leads to a particular aspect of functional flexibility, which is that there has been a process in the last 30 years around the world, including Australia, of occupational dismantling. Anybody who says this has been a period of labour market deregulation should take up something like sewage cleaning or gardening or tiddlywinks, because they don't know what they're talking about. There have been more new labour regulations introduced in this period than at any time, any comparable period in history. And if you look at what's been happening with occupational regulation, there's been a gradual shift away from self-regulation, the old guilds able to sort of pass down the ethics and standards within professions and crafts, to the state. The state has been increasingly regulating occupational life. And in the process of introducing licensing and negative licensing and various other mechanisms, they have been stratifying occupations internally. And I'll give you one example here just to give you a flavor of it, but there are many, many, many that I've given, particularly in the first book, which is that in 2007, in Britain and in several other countries that have been following that particular model, they got the big two, the medical professions and the bar. And they introduced an act. This is a Labour government that introduced it. Introduced an act which is called the Legal Services Act, which came into effect last October. And the Legal Services Act has been dubbed the Tesco Law. And the reason, it could be Coles Law or any other supermarket of your preference. Henceforth, you will be able to go into a supermarket of your choice, and you'll be able to go up to a woman or a man who will have a nice white tunic on, no doubt, and written across his or her chest will be Legal Services Assistant. The only thing you'll be sure about is that person will have had minimal legal training. And you'll go in and you'll say, well, this morning I'd like a divorce. Ah, sir, you'd like a divorce. Okay, you go over there, you press the relevant buttons for the type of divorce, and you should get a couple of forms out, fill them out, put them in the hole delegated, and you should get it by tomorrow morning. Now, if you're a consumer, you might think that's rather a good idea because you get a cheap divorce. But what is actually going to happen, and the lawyers and others are already predicting it, is that you are spreading a paralegal area. Just the same thing in the medicals. You've got paramedicals and para-teachers and para-this and para-that, who will have no probability of reaching the upper echelons of their profession. You are in a process of precariatizing occupations. The next point I want to make is that there has been a profound restructuring of the social protection systems of the world. Now here, Australia has the distinction of being among the leaders, but I wouldn't feel too proud about that, especially as other countries are catching you up very quickly. And the essence of what has happened has been a shift away from universalism and social insurance and all the models that underpin the welfare state to means testing that has to lead to behavior testing, because you have to determine if you're a deserving poor or an undeserving poor. If your poverty is deemed to be your fault, then we can deny you the benefit. Now, means testing has a number of pernicious effects. The first effect is that it always and must create poverty traps. A poverty trap arises from the fact that if you go from reliance on a benefit, however meager that benefit, to the sort of low-wage casual jobs that are emerging, you will face a tax rate. In the UK, it's worked out about 80%. It varies from country to country, but roughly that sort of level, all right? And even if you taper it with tax credits or whatever and do it over several months, you still have a marginal tax rate that the precariat have to face that is at least double what the middle class, the salariat, are having to face, and probably much more than double. If you had such a tax rate for the middle class, they would all be saying, we're going to leave the country. Whereas we expect the precariat to put up with that. But there's something even worse, because we're getting a situation now where the coerciveness and the intrusiveness of this behavior testing is going beyond the point of looking under people's bed to see if they have bed slippers of a possible breadwinner who may actually be just out of the house at the moment, going way beyond that to controlling people's activity. I've just come from the United States, and I was asked to present the book in the World Bank. Not the most ideal place to give this sort of book. And halfway through, I got to this point, and the chair, a very senior member of the World Bank, when I told the following story, he said, no, I bet you that's not true. He had to write to me the following morning apologizing because he'd gone to do a check. There are a growing number of US states that are applying a urine test for people applying for benefits. So you go along and you have to have your urine tested before you can gain entitlement to a benefit. What's the idea of that? Well, you see, urine tests could determine whether in fact you'd taken some illegal substance 12 months ago or something like that. And as a result, your poverty is your own fault. Now, this warped way of thinking is permeating social policy again and again around the world. To add a little insult to injury, the applicants must pay for their own urine tests. And often in the US, being the US and their medical system, that means $150 a shot, as it were. Of course, many people, and I think that's what's intended, don't go through with the urine test because they cannot afford the $150. But when I say there's something worse than the poverty trap and the behavioral intrusiveness that's developed, it is the development of what I call a precarity trap. And the precarity trap arises from the following development. And since the book came out, an extraordinary number of social workers from an extraordinary number of countries have written to me about examples that I could almost write a couple of new books based on their examples of the following. What happens is a person who loses a casual job applies for benefits. They go along and queue, they've paid the bus fare or whatever it is, they find they've got the wrong forms, they're speaking to the wrong person, they have to queue somewhere else, they go back, they do it again, they're still finding they're getting angry, they get put to the back of the queue, etc., etc., etc. And the process of application before a person gets a benefit can often be months. And in the case of disability, it can often be years before somebody actually gets their entitlement. Now imagine if you were such a person. Meanwhile, you've used up your friends, you've used up your savings, you've probably lost your apartment, and you've become very bitter. And then suddenly, that nice, friendly employment official says, the other side of Sydney, we've found there's a casual job. It pays a very minimal wage, but no benefits. It's only casual, but we think you should go for it. Now you think to yourself, I've got the poverty trap to worry about, and then I've got the precarity trap. Now I defy any first-year undergraduate student in economics to say that it is rational to go for such a job. It's a precarity trap of enormous and growing proportions. The next factor is something that I really would like to see some really fantastic PhD dissertations being done on, because I think I've only just touched on it in the book. That is, we are dealing with a process of tertiarization, a fancy word for the fact not that we're just all doing services, but we have a sense of tertiary time to deal with. In industrial society, you dealt with blocks of time. You got up in the morning, you went to the factory or mine for 10 hours, got home, had dinner, shouted at your family, went to bed. You got up, you went to school for a few years if you were lucky, had 30 years of labor if you were lucky, 2 years of retirement, dropped dead. Blocks of time. But in tertiary society, we are having to do activities all the time. We are losing a sense of workplace, because we're having to work all over the place, and we're losing a sense of anything like blocks of time. We have demands on our time that are almost continuous. And as a result, and I try and document this to some extent, you see that an enormous number of people have to do an enormous amount of work for labor. Work outside remunerated labor that they have to do. And if they don't do, they will pay the consequences of obsolescence or whatever. The HR gurus say that everybody, all of us in this room, should do 15 to 20% of our time every year, getting retrained. Now, if you're in the precariat, of course, there's no expected return to many of those forms of training. You do it in hope and diminishing hope. And tertiary time is leading to this precariatized mind that I mentioned earlier. But we don't have a concept other than to say that we know there's a pressure and a squeezing of time. And the big loss is the next subject that I want to deal with, which is that there has been a process of educational commodification. That commodification means that increasingly we are turning our tertiary and our secondary schooling processes into job preparation machines. We are stripping education of the subversive, cultural, radical elements that the education system was meant to provide. A sense of history, a sense of philosophy, a sense of culture. They're all dispensable because they don't help you prepare to be a job holder. And therefore they are dispensable. So we in academia, and I certainly find it very frustrating, I admit, but if there are some academics in the room who don't, I don't want to talk to them afterwards. We find that we are having to produce two commodities. The first commodity is called degrees, and the second commodity is called graduates. And we have to maximize the number of both. I'll give you one story, if I may, to take a little of your time. I apologize for that. Recently, and this is a true story, a professor at a well-known university had the audacity to fail 2 of his students. The dean called him in and said, "Jim, you can't fail students. You can give them deferred success, but not failure, because this will get outside and will put off future graduates coming to our university. Can't do that, Jim. Sorry." "Well, they failed. They were useless. They didn't do any work." "Jim, think about it over the weekend. I'll see you Monday morning." Comes in Monday morning. "Jim, come in. Want a coffee?" "Well, I'm sorry, they still fail. The Vice-Chancellor would like to see you." You can probably guess what happened. He lost his job. He was fired. It was a bit like Admiral Byng to encourage the others. He took the university to court. He won damages, but he did not get his job back. We are in a process of commodifying education, and the millions of students out there are not stupid. They know they are buying a lottery ticket. And that lottery ticket is costing more and more to buy. They're building up their debts. And yet it has a diminishing probability of having any success when they come out of university or college. So millions are becoming very frustrated and indebted, and I predict there will be an education bubble that will dwarf the subprime bubble in the next couple of years. The next question, I'm going very briefly on this one, is who is in the precariat? There are all groups in society, including all of us in this room, who have a risk of being in it, or our children do, or our friends. But clearly some groups have a higher probability than others. Somebody who's done a review of the book said, I said that all these groups are in the precariat. That's not what the book says, and it's not what I meant. What it says is that certain groups in society have a higher probability than others. Clearly educated youth, women, people with disabilities, the criminals, the welfare claimants drifting into this precariat. They all have a higher probability. I just want to say one thing about the biggest group of all, which is migrants. A very strange phenomenon is taking place, which is going to have enormous implications for all of us in the next few years. And that is, we're seeing the development of labor export regimes. China, Vietnam, Indonesia, to a certain extent India, and a number of other countries are literally organizing the mass movement of workers, often convicts, paid extremely low wages, around in bulk to do projects. Don't think it's only in Africa or in Asia or even Latin America. Recently, the Polish government put out its highway system to tender. The tender was won by a Chinese state capital company on condition that it could bring in its own workers. To add a little spice to the relationship, they received a subsidy from the European Union. So we in Europe have subsidized this process. It's happening in the Greek ports, it's happening in the Portuguese ports, it's happening in Italy. It's happening in many places. And I read a poem that was written on a door of a dormitory of one of these migrant camps. And I think it summarizes very poignantly one aspect of the precariat. The poem is, we are all floating around in the world. We meet each other, but we never really get to know each other. That somehow summarizes a real part of the precariat. And that leads to my last question. Where is the precariat taking us? Now, in the hope that the subject is of sufficient interest to you that you might want to read the book, you'll be glad to know I'm not going into the final chapter, because the first two of the last two chapters is a politics of inferno, with apologies to Dante. final chapter is a politics of paradise. And essentially what I try to do is map out, in the first case, what is likely to happen if the existing trends persist. And I think you can summarize it by saying that increasingly we will have societies of denizens where an increasing number of people lack one of the 5 forms of rights, if not more than one. We will have yawning inequalities, not addressed by the politicians because they're too beholden to the money from the elite. We will have the growth of a panopticon state. Those of you who remember Bentham and his panopticon apparatus, utilitarianism is the dominant ethos of governments around the world, the greatest happiness of the majority. But that allows them to make the minority as miserable as they want. And the panopticon apparatus is including the intrusion of privacy, these coercive forms of workfare that are developing, the monitoring, the profiling that we're seeing growing around us without any effective agency to stop it. We are seeing at the same time the growth of libertarian paternalism, a fancy term that came into popularity in Chicago with a famous book called Nudge. Now, when Obama became president, he appointed one of the co-authors of Nudge as the chief regulator with an office in the White House. Not to be outdone, David Cameron, when he became prime minister last year, 2010 now, when he became prime minister, he appointed the other co-author as an advisor when they set up what was beautifully described as a behavioral insight team reporting to the Prime Minister in Downing Street. Very quickly it became the Nudge Unit. And the Deputy Prime Minister had the audacity, and he's actually ordered a copy of my book I subsequently found after he made this statement, which is, this is to make sure that more people make the right choice. So we're going to find mechanisms to make you make the right choice. And don't think this is just a joke. The incentives and the penalties get altered so that people have to adapt to norms that they wouldn't choose for themselves. But the worst feature of this politics of inferno is that while all this is going on, we are seeing the growth of a neo-fascist populism around the world. Populist politicians are playing on the fears, particularly the fears of this first part of the Precariat, and saying it is the fault of strangers. It's the fault of the migrants, the Muslims, the Jews, the Catholics, whichever group. You, me. It's their fault. Elect me and we will deal with that. In Europe, we're seeing the far right growing incredibly fast. Even in places like Sweden, where it's practically as large as the government. In Austria now, the polls are saying that the far right is more popular than any of the government parties. It's a thing that's spreading with the Tea Party and the Japanese equivalent and all sorts of other movements. And of course, it is dragging right-of-centre parties further to the right as they try and not lose votes. Now, this is a frightening prospect. When the Financial Times reviewed the book, they said I predicted it. If you read it, it doesn't predict it. It says that this is a disturbing possibility. I think we won't repeat history. I think we've got enough wisdom, enough education, enough culture that we will beat this far-right tendency, but not if we underestimate the fears that are growing. That leads to the last chapter, which I won't go into, as I said, but I just want to mention the principles that guided and related work. We are at the pivotal point of a global transformation. Those of you who know Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation will see it as analogous to that. And I was very pleased that Karl Polanyi's daughter endorsed the bigger book. And in that process, we have gone through a disembedded phase dominated by financial capital, just as in the 19th and early 20th century, the same thing happened. And inequalities and insecurities have multiplied to the point where we are at a rather dangerous phase. I was asked on the radio earlier today whether Australia was the lucky country and it was going to be the exception. And I said, well, it may be lucky and it's a lovely country and I love coming here, but I don't think anybody should be too smug that we're going to escape here or anywhere else. What we're seeing is this Polanyian moment where we have the possibility of a new form of politics, a new form of the search for the great trinity of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And in the process, we have to remember three principles. The first principle is that every forward march towards a more equal, fairer society is defined by the needs, insecurities, and aspirations of the emerging mass class. That means that it will be profoundly different this time than it was early part of the 20th century. The second principle that needs to be remembered, particularly by Labour parties or social democratic parties, because they've lost the plot altogether, is that every forward march is defined by new forms of collective action. Now, I'm somewhat critical of old-style Labour unions in the book, but enough union friends know that I'm not anti-union. And gradually I noticed that I'm being asked to speak to union groups because they're becoming aware that they need to change their model radically. If you're addressing a large group of people in and around the Precariat in Europe, the best way of emptying the room like a flash is to talk about unions. That's the degree of alienation that has been reached. But we need forms of collective action and collective agency. Without that, we're all vulnerable. We need groups to represent our interests inside social policy agencies, inside those occupational boards, and elsewhere in society, to give a voice to those groups who are facing the worst forms of insecurity. And the third principle is that every forward march is about three overlapping struggles. A struggle for recognition, that means identifying oneself or one's group as belonging to something with a sense of common purpose. A recognition, and this is coming. You saw it in the Occupy movements. I was asked to address a number of them last year. You saw it in the Indignados in Madrid, in the Syntagma Square in Athens. I've had the good fortune to be invited to those places. You see it, and people are now increasingly proud to say, I am in the Precariat. I am in the Precariat. And that is the first stage in a process. And that's why these riots and whatever actions last year were the actions of primitive rebels. They know what they're against, but they don't know yet what is the future as a good agenda. And the second struggle is for representation. Representation inside the state, in the various organs of the state, having a voice that can be counted in the bargaining process. And the third form is redistribution. The struggle for redistribution, which will not be the same as the socialist project of the 20th century. It will be about the assets that matter in life in a tertiary society. And that includes control over time. It includes control over access to the public spaces, to the commons, the ecological commons. One of the horrible things that are happening with these austerity budgets around the world is that they're shrinking the commons, closing parks, closing public museums, public libraries. The great city of Manchester has just announced the closure of all its public toilets. 999 of them, or something like that. In the United States, we're seeing fire brigades only going to the rich areas because they haven't got enough staff to cover the poor. This sort of shrinking of the commons affects the precariat much more than any other group. They use the public parks, the public toilets, the museums, the libraries, and so on, to much greater extent than the elite, who can do without those. And we need to struggle over the access to knowledge, to security itself, and above all, to financial capital. These are the assets over which the struggle will take place. And I believe that the agenda of moving towards a redistributive income policy, where a basic income is provided as a floor for all of us, will be the hallmark of moving into this next phase. Any of you who's interested can look on our Bien webpage or join. Some of the people in this room I know are members of Bien. We're having some great success at the moment. In Brazil, they've introduced what is in effect a basic income. They said it couldn't be done. Last year, Lula came and I had the great privilege of speaking with him for an hour and a half. And he said, I only got re-elected because we'd introduced this policy. Now, many more than 50 million, it's going on for 55 million Brazilians, receives a basic income cash transfer every month. At the moment, we're doing a big experiment in India, where thousands and thousands of villages are receiving cash transfers, unconditional, and where we're monitoring the effects on their lives. Nutrition of children is growing, school attendance is growing, performance is going up, women's status is improving, economic dynamism is growing. Instead of wasting the money going into bureaucratic corruption, we're just giving people straightforward cash transfers and saying, make something of your life. No conditions. It's taking place in Africa, and a few other places are experimenting in rich countries. I believe we have to move away from the conditional, controlling mentality of means testing and behavior testing and demonizing the losers to a more convivial form of society. And that, I very much hope, is what will happen. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was just curious why the precariat was the dangerous class. Was it because they would overthrow the kind of conservative elite, or is it because they would join the fascists, or how are they dangerous beyond lacking empathy or whatever?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. The essence of the answer is that first and foremost, they are in danger, they're dangerous for the mainstream political parties of yesterday. They don't associate with old-style social democrats of the 20th century. It's a real irony that since the crisis began, unlike all previous crises, the so-called left has been losing everywhere. They're dangerous to them, they're dangerous to the centre-right because they don't identify with their neoliberal free market ethos. And increasingly, some of them are drawn to the far left and some of them are drawn to the far right, which makes them dangerous in a different way. But there's another form of danger, which is that increasingly people will feel politically disenfranchised and politically detached. And they'll sit on their backsides, even if they have to vote, as in a couple of countries, including Australia. They'll sit on their backsides when it comes to political participation and allow us to have commodified politics that is a real frightening prospect going ahead, where we listen to some charismatic person who finds the right buzzwords every couple of years when an election comes around. We have a real prospect of thinning democracy and a commodification of public life. So it's a multiple form of political threat.
Hello, I'm Alison Roll from the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Thank you very much for your talk. We're conducting an inquiry into insecure work at the moment, and I suppose one of the challenges that you've alluded to is that mobilisation issue, and how do we actually get political leverage from workers who are essentially in a position of weakness with no rights, and that's one of the things we're grappling with. So very much hearing all of those stories from Australian workers at the moment.
Yeah, I have your latest document. I think this is your report, and some of your colleagues have been in touch with me. I think the chronic insecurity that your committee, this is an inquiry into insecure work, insecure jobs. I think you've got to make sure that you look into these occupational dimensions. You've got to look into the potential of new forms of collective representation beyond traditional labour unions. And here we do see some exciting models that are taking shape. I work in India a lot, and this project we're doing, we work with SEWA. SEWA is the Self-Employed Women's Association, which has millions of women who are in casual, insecure positions in life. And their model is far more flexible and outreaching than the standard labour unions. And one of the ironies was that for many years, the International Confederation of Trade Unions opposed them being allowed to come into the ILO on the grounds that they weren't a proper union. But fortunately, sense has finally prevailed, and SEWA is a widely respected organization doing fantastic work. But you have other groups like the Permalancers in New York and elsewhere, which are providing a service that is gradually mobilizing insecure groups. But I think it's very important in your sort of inquiry to map the diverse patterns of insecurity that people are experiencing.
Yes. My question is, you were talking about the commodification of education, where universities, for example, turn out more lawyers, more media studies people than can possibly be absorbed by a normal economy. How does that sort of explain the fact that you can't get doctors? You have to bring in brain drain third world countries for doctors in most first world countries.
I'm not sure I follow the logic, so apologies if I answer you incorrectly. The educational commodification is including this incredible spread of privatization of secondary schooling as well as tertiary schooling. And in the process, there's an ideological shift taking place. I think that's the sort of thing one should really be worried about. One also should be worried about the point that you ended up on, which is that the supply of doctors is being diverted from developing countries. You know, there are more doctors from Malawi in Liverpool than there are in Malawi. You know, things like that. But there's an irony of this crisis. I've just been looking at the figures. It's an extraordinary thing. For the first time in history, there's a flood of qualified people leaving Europe. They came here, of course, so it's not something new here. But that flood is often going to developing countries. There are hundreds of thousands of Spaniards and Portuguese who've been going to Brazil and Argentina and other parts of Latin America, taking their architectural skills, their doctor's skills, and so on. And a huge number of Portuguese qualified people have now been moving to their old colonies in Africa. So you're seeing a process of circulation taking place, which I presume someone in your position would regard as a healthier situation than if there were floods of brain drain from developing to rich countries. But of course, with licensing systems, we are creating barriers preventing people from practicing their skills. So it's quite common that you get a taxi driver and you find that he's got a PhD from his country, but he can't practice that particular skill in whatever the country it is, simply because the licensing system prevents him or her doing so. So we've got to change the licensing system and shift towards an accreditation system for most occupations. An accreditation system is, if I choose to employ him, sorry, you're only because you're at the front, as my dentist, and he tells me that he is a dentist, and I choose to believe him, caveat emptor, right? I don't think he is a dentist, but there you are. I mean, the essence of it, accreditation should be that allows people to move around more easily and practice their competencies. I hope that answers the gist.
How do you deal with the problem that governments adopting your recommendations are committing political suicide? Government adopting your recommendations would be committing political suicide.
Why?
Because the middle class, and to some extent the precariat, have been brainwashed that the only way to go is the current implementation of the capitalistic system and the free market, which means lower taxes on the rich because they are creating the job, they are creating the benefits. Like President Obama would love to embrace some of what you're recommending, but the moment he does that, he would be pulled down.
Well, I think many of these governments will commit political suicide, as you put it, if they don't move in the sort of direction I'm talking about. I remember in 2001, we had discussions with the newly elected President Lula, and his middle-class advisors said, no, you can't possibly introduce the Bolsa Familia, this cash transfer program, because it will lead to a run on the banks, the capital will leave the country, etc., etc. It took a lot of time to persuade him that, in fact, he could do it. He took a risk. He took a big risk. Now, the biggest supporters of this vast change of policy that he's engineered come from the middle class because they know that they've enabled people, a growing majority of people, to feel that they are citizens in their own country. And since this policy was introduced, contrary to what all the IMF and the others were saying, poverty has gone down, income inequality has gone down dramatically, unemployment is at its lowest ever, and economic growth is at the most rapid ever in that country. Now, when he had this discussion last summer, one of the things he said, which struck me as quite strong, he said, I know I was re-elected only because of this policy, but I wish other government leaders would be more innovative and address these crises. Now, the great thing about the Occupy movement last year, and there were some negatives, so I don't want to romanticize it, is that it marked, I think, a harbinger of a change of attitudes. Fear has changed sides again. Suddenly, governments and Davos lovers are talking about the need to address inequality. For years, they just ignored it. Suddenly, they're talking about, well, we can't sustain what is happening without major threats along the way. I think you'll see this year the Occupy movement, the Euromaiday movement, the various other movements that have been growing become much more integrated, much more progressive in demanding changes of a certain type. And the politicians will suddenly start having to listen. I hope that happens, but I think there are reasons for believing that it must happen, because we cannot allow the inequalities that we've seen to grow and grow and grow, and the insecurities that we've been talking about continue, without a lot of social sickness and a lot of nasty things along the way. So contrary to, say, the classic neoliberal argument, there is no alternative, I think we're seeing a change at the moment. It's not yet very strong, but there are certain signs in the wind where people are becoming more open to new ideas. I think that the subtitle of the first book is called Building Occupational Citizenship. And that the idea is that it should enable, the policies and institutions should enable all of us to combine different forms of work as we go through life. At certain times doing more care work for our friends, our relatives or whatever. At certain times do more labor and having more sense of control. One of the reasons I favor moving towards an unconditional universal basic income is that it will give people a greater sense of control over their time, a greater ability that in extremis, if a highly exploitative employer comes along, you can say a version of no, any words you choose. That sense of having the capacity of individual agency and saying, I value my time, I want to work. 95% of people want to work. We're not a human species that is averse to wanting to work, to reproduce ourselves, our society, and so on. We have to find ways of encouraging reproductive work, ecological, preserving work, looking after the commons, looking after our communities and ourselves, more than just pouring tea for the boss. And the first thing I would say, if there are any labor statisticians in here, is that we need a radical reform of our labor statistics, so that we actually have statistics that measure what is happening in our society. Our labor statistics are trash. I'm sorry, they are trash. When you read that the average working week is 8.2 hours for full-time employees, I promise you it's complete bunk. I'm a labor statistician, so this is one subject I can really talk with some confidence about, in the sense that we do not measure or respect these various forms of work that we all know about. And we have to mock the social scientists, the politicians, who systematically ignore the various forms of reproductive work and other forms of work that take place in society. And it's becoming much greater as a result of this tertiarization that I was talking about. Now, I believe that you can have a whole set of policies to encourage us to have greater sense of control so that we can do work that is not labor. I propose in the books a slow time movement, which is a nice way of saying we need to find ways of slowing down and having more time for what the ancient Greeks called schole, which was a combination of learning and public participation as citizens. We have squeezed schole systematically in our market society so that the capacity to participate in the public life of society has been diminished. I will often talk to students and find they're graduate students from all over the world, and they have remarkably little knowledge of their own history, of their own civic traditions. And they feel that it's not really necessary to learn those things. Now, if you have a society that has no respect for this form of work, then don't be surprised if the Philistines are ruling us with disdain. I think we've got to have a much greater sense of gaining control over time for everybody. I hope that answers the question.
I've got a couple of questions to ask. Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting. Big picture, and this development of a new progressive politics is to be welcomed. But there's an awful lot going into the ideas that you're doing. It's almost a kind of kitchen sink approach. Everything which is wrong with the world gets thrown in there. And I just wonder whether we could reflect and just try and unpack a couple of issues. And one of them is, I just wonder whether you're in danger of falling into your own trap in the terms of being gender blind in the analysis. When you were talking about the precariat, you almost threw everybody in there, the educated, the uneducated, migrants, women. And that's a very disparate group. It's also very heterogeneous in its interests and its background. And that matters when it comes to talking about the varieties of precariat, because it's clear from research in the United States and Europe that the model precariat group, which is the creative workers, have very different experiences depending upon their race, sex, and background. And in a stark sense, if you're white, you're male, you're middle class, you're more likely to find more secure employment as part of the precariat than if you're black, if you're a woman, and you're from the working class. So there's a big issue there about, should we be bringing additional analysis into that? And the second question is this a historical analysis, in the sense that a lot of the things that you've been talking about defined other workers in other times. They're being denizens, they're being itinerant. And I'm just thinking about the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when dock workers were the precariat, when farm workers were the precariat, and painters and decorators were the precariat, the ragged trouser philanthropist were the precariat. So what's different now about the new precariat to the old precariat? And I guess the question is this just a middle-class whinge?
Well, you compressed a lot of insulting points into that, so let me try and let me try and give a short answer, and say that I hope that if you read it, you will be disillusioned from that particular perspective. I tried to preempt the first point when I said that I'm not saying that all those groups are all in the precariat. I said, and I will repeat it now, that there are certain groups that have a higher risk, a higher probability of being pushed into a precariat set of circumstances. Now, I think that is a different issue. If you're a woman, you're likely to have a higher risk of being pushed into insecure types of labor and work, and all the consequences that pile up from that. If you're a migrant, ditto. It doesn't mean that all women are in the precariat, or that all migrants are in the precariat. The second point you make is that it's just a repeat of history. I try and argue in both books that it is not a proto-proletariat, if you want to go into traditional class analysis. Because what we're seeing is people being habituated to unstable labor as the norm. The period that you are talking about, and actually goes back further, when there was a period of casualization, was in the process of trying to discipline an industrial proletariat. And that sense of discipline was brilliantly analyzed by the historian E.P. Thompson and by Eric Hobsbawm and others, about disciplining people to be regimented by the clock and to be disciplined in labor, so that the exploitation that took place was in labor, in between the time you entered the factory gate or the mine and the time you went home and dropped to sleep. This sense now is that the precariat is actually exploited and oppressed outside their labor. Now, this is a new phenomenon, and also that they're expected to be flexible and adaptable so that they can be moved around both inside their employment or within different labor markets, and be made employable, and have to invest in their own retraining, training, or whatever it is, again and again and again. It's outside the labor process that they're being exploited. And the final thing, as I mentioned earlier, is this lack of an occupational identity and narrative over a growing number of people that is wanted by the system. That they want a flexible, adaptable labor supply. So what you're seeing is a process of precariatization, of habituating people to accept a life of instability. Whereas the process of proto-proletarianization in the early 20th century was one of drawing the remnants into an industrial proletariat process. I think that's historically quite different. And what I try and do is I've drawn up a charter of policies for the precariat that are actually quite different from the policies that would have been appealing to the labor proletariat. So I urge you, just to be a little open, because I know it's controversial, but this is a period in history where I think we have to think out of the box and see new trends as new. Thank you.
Could I just say thank you for that speech. As a long-term casual academic, it was depressing but also heartening to hear. But I wonder, I can't help feeling, as we sit here at Sydney University with the logo of Sydney University behind you as you're giving this speech, that there's an elephant in the room, which is the fact that Sydney University notoriously has just shed a great deal of its staff in pursuit, or not a great deal of its staff, but a large number in terms of getting rid of decent jobs. And the workforce here, as at other universities, is increasingly heavily casualised. And so I wanted to acknowledge that, but also to ask you, you also mentioned speaking to the World Trade Organization, and I wonder what you think about the possibilities and problematics of working through institutions like most Western universities or like the World Trade Organization, using those as venues for your message, which have so deeply chosen to be implicated in the kind of neoliberal structures that are a deep cause of the problems that you're describing.
Well, again, you've put in quite a few things into your question. First of all, if it's any comfort whatsoever, and I'm sure it isn't, you are far from alone at the University of Sydney. This casualisation of academic life is one of the great developments that we haven't looked at, and looked at the implications of sufficiently. And it's making for a lot of very cowardly academics, because they're all frightened of losing their tenure or losing their grants or whatever it is they're losing, and they become part of the panopticon. We see it in Britain, we see it everywhere, in the sense that we're meant to be grading each other, trying to be out-competing each other, trying to get this and that over one another, and it's really pathetic. It's a pathetic development, and we should revolt against it. Now, if you think of yourself as on the verge of the precariat, and you're possibly on the proficient side, possibly on the precariat, I think you'll probably appreciate my next remark, which is that we need a much greater sense of agency, collective agency. It gets back to the union issue, where the voice of those people who are at risk of being part of the precariat becomes much stronger. We need you and colleagues to be part of the governance structure of universities and teaching institutions. And as long as your voice, you as representative of the precariatized part of the profession, is ignored, then the process will go on. The rich academics, the stars, will go on making their big incomes and getting big grants and big this and big that, but they shouldn't be too smug, because the administrators will come for them later. And I think we have to realize that this is a collective action problem, and we have to be on your side, or my side, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of that. Very strangely, the Director General of, you mentioned the World Trade Organization. I didn't mention the WTO, I mentioned the World Bank. But the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, has just written an article where he quotes favorably, so I'm really worried, from my book. I'm going to see what it is that he says, but he says that the essence of his remark is that we should be alarmed by this development and take note of it. So if someone in his position is doing so, I think someone's listening, and that's at least good news. But I want to end my comment on your question by wishing you every success. And I think we need to stand up collectively to oppose this trend.
Hello? I have a question regarding social values and precariat, and that's about comparison, and that people, I think everyone in the room now wants more. They are not satisfied anymore with what their peer groups have. For example, my parents, they compared themselves with their neighbors, but nowadays I think people are comparing themselves with people who have more and want more. So I'm wondering whatever new working styles or thinking out the box things are available, if people are always comparing with someone who has more, then it will be an uphill battle and will eventually end in mayhem and chaos. So I'm wondering if you have a comment to that.
Well, the only comment, because I think it goes with the previous questions, the only comment is specifically what you've said, is that one of the features of this growing precariat is a larger and larger proportion of it are suffering from relative deprivation, in the sense that they can look back to people who had more privileged positions, even inside their own communities, and they're feeling a sense of losing constantly. They're losing this, they fear losing this. The worst symptom of all is called the bagged lady syndrome, where millions of women, apparently in the United States and Canada and a few other countries, wake up during the night fearing that they are just one mishap away from being out in the streets with all their belongings in a couple of bags. That is real fear. If you've got a large number of people suffering this fear of loss, then I think it's a crisis. Sorry, yes. Well, I do address this question, and in my discussions with the Occupy groups that I addressed last year, obviously had to address it more frontally than I've done this evening. But I believe strongly that what we need is national sovereign wealth funds. There are now 40 countries that have national capital funds, where surplus profits from various means are put into a pot that is managed by the state for various investments and distributional purposes. Most of those 40 are ruled by people we wouldn't like, but some of them are very progressive instruments, including the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a capital fund that was set up in 1983, which redistributes to every citizen of Alaska each year what amounts to a basic income through putting some of the profits into this fund. The one country in Europe that has managed to buck the crisis more than any other is Norway. And Norway has a national capital fund. A number of other countries, including France, they've suddenly woken up to the fact that they need one. Brazil is establishing one. It doesn't have to be based on oil. It can be based on taxes of monopolies, natural monopolies, and there are various technical terms, if you want to discuss them afterwards, which is pooling certain types of profit, and particularly financial capital gains. We don't need to move necessarily to a Tobin tax, although I believe in a Tobin tax, but I don't think too much can be expected. But we need to tax super profits and put it into a national fund and use that for a distributing to the whole population of the country. And I think you will see the development of these funds becoming more central to the debate. Yeah, but as long as we are here and we have a voice and we can meet and we can vote, then we can't complain if we sit on our asses. I'm serious. We have to realize that we cannot excuse them getting away with it. We need to become much more politically engaged, whether it's supporting whatever movement or any group. But I always think that we've tended to allow them to get away with it and haven't made enough noise and put real pressure. I'm not being idealistic, I hope. I think that we really have reached the point where we must all count ourselves and be involved. That was a great thing that happened last year. You can criticize the Occupy movements, you can criticize the indignados for this and that, but there was a sudden energy, a collective energy to say, no, 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 we're not allowing this. We've got to stop this. We're seeing the wonderful courage in the Middle East. That courage is fantastic. They may lose in a big way in the short term, many losing their lives as we're seeing on the television, but the courage is there, and in our small way, we should all be doing our bit. And I'm not saying any of us here are not, but I think we need to look in the mirror and say that we have not been sufficiently motivated and active in the last few years, and we need to change that.